Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Professional Development Webinar Series brought to you by Ave Maria Press. We're here with Ann Garrido, who's going to talk with us about redeeming conflict, which is inspired by the title of her book, Redeeming Conflict. And she's going to share some strategies for working through some ministerial challenges in your parishes and diocesan offices. Real quickly, some of the technical info here. My name is Jared Dees, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. I'm the Digital Marketing Manager here at Ave Maria Press. I want to share a big shout out and thank you to our partners in this series. They've been partners from the very beginning of this series, going back years ago. The National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. So everyone here is muted, but you can ask questions, and you've already been telling us where you're from in the questions section, but type in a question anytime during the presentation, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can towards the end of the webinar today. So type those in during and also at the end, and we'll share some of those questions with Ann towards the end. So with that, I'd like to note that we'll quickly note that the webinar is being recorded, and we'll send a recording out to you later this week. So look for your email inboxes for that. So first of all, I want to pick a very warm welcome to Ann Garrido, who's talking with us about redeeming conflict, strategies for working through ministerial challenges. Ann is an associate professor of homiletics at Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis, Missouri. While her first passion is teaching, for more than 15 years, she has found herself increasingly drawn to administrative roles. Garrido has served as senior editor of Human Development magazine and is the author of 5 books, including the award-winning Redeeming Administration. She travels nationally and internationally doing conflict education and mediation work in both business and church worlds. She lives in Florida, but you're probably more likely to see her out on the road during her many speaking engagements. So Ann, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Jared, thank you.
All right, I'm going to pass things over to you for your presentation.
Great.
Okay.
Let me go to.
Looks great.
Well, thanks, Jared. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm thrilled. I'm very excited to be with all of you this afternoon. I know that the years, even decades of service that the members of this group have given to the church, and well, indeed, it'd be fascinating to add up all of those years of service that have been given to the church of those who are on this call, because I suspect that it could easily be as many years as the church itself has been around. So please know that I don't take that lightly, and that what I have to say this afternoon, I say with a great deal of humility, because I acknowledge that you also have so much experience and wisdom that could be shared on the topic that we're going to be talking about. So I myself have worked for the church now for about 30 years, which I know sounds really a crazy thing to say since I still fancy myself to be a young adult, but it's the only place for myself that I ever imagined working. I remember that when I was really young, I used to hear stories during the Easter season each year from the book of Acts, stories of the earliest years of the church where the disciples preached and everybody was so moved by the preaching that they turned their lives and their goods over to the church, and everyone lived happily ever after. Now, my dad, who was an accountant for a large company, he would come home from work regularly looking kind of stressed out and burdened by the dynamics of the business world. And I thought to myself, well, when I grow up, I want to go and work for the church, because, you know, that's the place where everybody gets along and everyone lives happily ever after. So I started working for the church as a receptionist in our parish center at the tender age of 14, and was rather quickly disabused of that notion. At that time, we had 4 priests who were assigned to the parish of varying ecclesiologies, a full-time housekeeper, a convent of sisters next door, a bustling school right across the parking lot. And it turns out that even in thriving Christian communities, the keys get lost, the gym gets double booked, sisters yell, nobody empties the dishwasher. And I guess I would probably say the climax of my receptionist experience was on Easter Vigil, my senior year of high school, when the maintenance man lit the parish school on fire right before Easter Vigil began in order to express and make clear his feelings about a building renovation project that was about to be undertaken. At that point, it became very clear to me that the church is certainly not a place where people live happily ever after. And at the time, I thought something has to be really wrong with the church, that we had fallen so far from that graced era of the Acts of the Apostles. And clearly, with the situation of arson, we very much had. But this question was framed for me in a really new way in my mid-20s when I began graduate studies in theology and discovered the fossils of the early Christian communities as they're found in the letters of St. Paul. Now, you know, even though these are placed after the book of Acts in the Bible, they actually were written before the book of Acts. They were written even before the Gospels. The earliest of Paul's letters date to around 45 AD, whereas the earliest gospel is written somewhere around 70 AD. So Paul's letters are really the earliest form of Christian literature that we have in existence. And what they reveal was that there was never a time when the church was without conflict. Even in the years immediately following the resurrection, Jesus barely burst forth from the tomb, and already his followers are arguing about who should be able to come to the table and who not, what was the role of women to be in their community, how to pay ministers, how to distribute alms fairly. Many of the issues that we still are dealing with today, they were already arguing about. And 2,000 years later, the church continues to go on. Now, I know that the story that I'm telling is not unique. It probably mirrors, in many ways, your own journey, just as it mirrors the journey of almost every longtime disciple. This kind of pattern of attraction and disillusionment and hope and coming to terms with reality. And what I have discovered over the last 30 years is that what distinguishes those who are able to live meaningfully within the church as it is from those who are continually frustrated in their attempts to live happily ever after is that ability to function constructively within a church that is going to be in conflict or in tension. Because, now arsonists aside, that is not necessarily a bad place to be. Discord in much of Christian thought is understood as a consequence of sin, that God intended for the world to live in harmony, but sin caused discord. And as a result, Christians tend to see the presence of conflict in their communities as a sign of sin, that something has gone terribly wrong and that it needs fixing. But the Christian tradition can offer a wider and more nuanced theology of conflict. That while sin certainly escalates much of the conflict in our world, raising it to the level of bitterness and arson and even war, the roots of conflict seem inherently structured into the design of creation itself. That God created a world with tremendous amount of diversity in it, and indeed seems to glory in the diversity of creation. And diversity implying here not just a diversity of species, or even a diversity of languages, of skin color, of ethnicities, but also a diversity of culture, diversity of opinion, a diversity of worldview and perspective, and exposure to diversity with this kind of resulting discomfort and surprise and disagreement appears to be the way that God is maturing creation and helps us to become all that God dreams us to be. So communities that report no tension or no conflict, oftentimes upon a closer look, tend not to be vibrant, caring communities, but more likely are comatose. Because we really only argue about things that we care about. And if no one is arguing about anything within your community, it may mean that nobody cares about the decisions that are being made, that no one cares about the direction in which your parish is heading. And that often is a bad sign rather than a good one. So what I want to do during this hour is to talk about how we can maximize the potential of conflict within our communities to help us to learn and grow and mature, while at the same time minimizing the potential of conflict to divide and to fragment and to burn down the building, whether literally or metaphorically speaking. So in the book that Jared talked about, I mentioned 12 different habits that we want to learn and practice on a regular basis so that they can become like second nature to us. And here in this hour, I'll probably just talk about the first three that will help us get into the conversations that we want to be having. And what I'm thinking about doing is to role play a sample conversation that's probably going on in some way, shape, or form all over the United States right now, given the time of year that we're in. And if I roll through the sample conversation, if you want to think up your own sample conversation from your own life, from your own ministry, and think through it as we go through these steps, I think the transferability of the points will still remain apparent. And if not, in the end, we'll make sure to leave a little bit of time for questions to ask. So here's the scenario. 3 weeks before Easter, you're going to run the Triduum worship aid by the pastor for a final look over before it goes to the printer, who has already emailed you twice asking where it is because they're working with shipping deadlines. And you get a voicemail from the pastor saying that he wants to talk to you about changing just a few of the songs. So tell me, what does this conversation oftentimes look like in its first iteration? At least if you're anything like me at all, the first version of this conversation is going to look something like this. It's not going to take place with the pastor. It's going to take place with the DRE down the hall. Can you believe this? We've been practicing for Triduum since Advent, and he wants to change the music now? He is out of his mind. Does this seem realistic to you? Oftentimes, I think in Christian communities, the first take on a difficult conversation is not necessarily between the persons who are actually in tension with one another. Conflict originates with two people who see something different, but in real life, it often draws in a third person, and then sometimes a fourth person, and sometimes a fifth person very quickly. Triangulation is this tendency to bring third parties into the disagreement. And in its most blatant form, triangulation involves explicitly asking others to support our point of view and lend their weight to influence the outcome in our direction. But oftentimes triangulation, we may triangulate without even knowing that we're doing it. By informally sharing our perspective to blow off steam, like I would do with the DRE, saying all those things that you don't dare say face-to-face with the one who you're actually frustrated with. The psychologist Ted Dunn notes that triangulation really flourishes in situations where people are conflict avoidant and in situations where people feel like they don't have the power and authority to influence the situation via the approved channels. So if this is true, naturally we can expect that triangulation is going to flourish in church life, because as we noted earlier, our pews and our parish offices are filled with people who tend to associate conflict with sin, hence always to be avoided, and who often have few, if any, formal means to influence ecclesial decision-making in a hierarchical structure. So as ministers, we have all experienced the dangers of triangulation in parish life. That parent who gets all of the other school families to sign a petition to the PTA instead of directly talking to the principal. Or the person who writes a letter to the diocese about a perceived liturgical violation rather than speak to the liturgy director. We wish that other people would just speak with us directly before they got other people involved if they're aggravated. But oftentimes we ourselves, when we're faced with a really troubling situation in which we feel like we're the ones who are lacking power in this situation, it's really hard not to slip into those same patterns of behavior that we despise. So effective conflict management begins with speaking directly to the person, even when the power differential may increase your sense of nervousness about doing so. If you need to talk to a friend about the situation and get advice and bolster your courage, that's fine, so long as it's clear that you're not asking the friend to get involved or to take sides, and that the purpose of that conversation is really to get coaching, not to garner support. So don't say anything to your friend about the situation that you wouldn't be willing to bring up or talk about with the other person directly. Be aware that anything that you share with the other person could somehow get back to the absent party, even if that is not your intent. And that the more public a conversation becomes, the less likely our pastor figure, or anyone for that matter, is going to be to change their mind. Once a disagreement becomes public, the persons tend to become more wedded to their positions than willing to change their mind. But when the conversation remains just between the two of you, the stakes are lower for each of the participants, and it leaves more space for comfortably rethinking earlier statements without much embarrassment. So let's just pretend now that I'm going to go talk to the pastor directly about this outrageous request to make changes in the Triduum program. And maybe the next stage, I would tend to start something like this. Father Greg, I got your call, and I just wanted to stop by and let you know that while I could change like a spelling error or something like that in the Triduum program, please don't ask me to change any of the songs. There isn't time for the choir to practice anything new, and the printer is already on my case for this program being 24 hours late. Now, I wonder, does that also seem to be somewhat realistic in your own experience? That we can tend to enter tense conversations by trying to persuade the other person to see things from our point of view. But here's the thing. I don't actually have the ability to change the pastor's mind. And it's not just because he's the pastor. Truth be told, I don't have the power to change anyone's mind, not even a 2-year-old, maybe especially not a 2-year-old. The only person whose mind I have the power to change is my own. So before speaking to your pastor or your coworker about what troubles you, let go of the notion that the primary purpose of this conversation is persuasion. Instead, we want to set more manageable goals just going into the conversation. There are still many things that you can gain from this conversation and from talking directly to this person, even if the other person doesn't change their mind. The first thing is that you can learn something that you don't already know. What does this person see differently? Why does this matter to him? What data does he have that led him to arrive at this conclusion? What's the intent behind his decision? Why does this line of action seem to make sense to him? Because the story I have in my mind is he's doing this because he's lost his mind. But he himself would probably not say, I've decided to change the Triduum program because I've lost my mind. So I can find out what his version of the story is. The second thing that I can always, a goal that I can have going into a conversation, is to share my perspective. You can share what the impact of the decision has been on you, how you're feeling, what runs through your mind when you think about following through on what the pastor's asking, the doubts that you're wrestling with, the data that you're looking for that maybe your pastor doesn't have. And finally, you can invite your boss to problem solve with you to figure out the best way to go forward. Sometimes when you share your own backstory, the pastor will become more aware as to the difficulties that their request has created for you, and he'll change his mind. It does happen. Sometimes over the course of one of these conversations, you'll discover more about what your pastor's dealing with and the reasons why they are asking, and you'll come to agree with them and the course of action that they want to pursue. And sometimes both of you will be able to figure out a third option that meets both of your interests. All three of those potential outcomes constitute a win, not just the first one. So be open to any one of those three things happening. So now let's reframe this conversation one more time, and we'll use this as our opening line instead. Father Greg, got your phone call, wanted to check in with you and talk about this idea of making a few song changes in the Triduum program. Here, in this opening line, we've got a good start to a conversation. Note that the way that it's framed is what we would say objective. It doesn't take a stand right from the start. It just names what the topic of conversation that we want to talk about is. Now that we're in the door, we could ask, well, what will help in this conversation? Even though we don't control the outcome of the conversation, there are some things that we can do to elevate our chances of positively influencing this situation, even when we're not in charge. So each of us stakes a position in a conflict based on what we consider to be really, really important. Example, I will not change any of the Triduum songs because it will require extra choir practice and there's no time for additional choir practice and the choir will have my neck. Oftentimes when we go into these conversations, we've well thought out the reasons that support the position that we're holding. We think that by sharing these superlative reasons, the other person is going to be so wowed by the strength of our arguments that he's going to change his mind. But it rarely goes that way. Instead, what happens is the other person becomes defensive and more intractable and keeps giving us his reasons as to why he's right. So in the business world in the 1980s, there were two profs, one from Harvard and MIT, who introduced a model to describe this dynamic that so frequently happens in tense conversations that they called the ladder of inference. They observed that in the world at any given time, there is a massive amount of data that is available, only some of which is actually accessible to us, but even of what is accessible to us, only a portion of which we actually pay attention to. So right now, you've got all sorts of stuff going on around you that you could be paying attention to. The slides that are in front of you, the sound of my voice, the color of the walls in your office, the emails that are dinging on your computer or your phone, the noise of coworkers who are walking by in the hall, the number of ceiling tiles that are above you. But you are choosing right now which of those you're deciding to be attentive to more than the others. I should add that one time one of my colleagues, when I was teaching about this ladder, when he was teaching with the ladder of inference, and he mentioned that the ceiling tiles, and somebody in the group that he was with said 182. Now, I need to let you know that as a presenter, that's like the worst thing that can ever happen to you, because the first thing that runs through your head is, how boring must I be that you are paying attention to the ceiling tiles? But he got a hold of himself and he asked, well, why do you know that? And the man said, well, I used to be a ceiling tile salesman. And I'm used to going into a store and I'm used to looking up and thinking, okay, this would take like 5 boxes. This job would cost about this much. He goes, it drives my wife nuts, but I can't stop it. Every store I go into, every place I go into, I'm always trying to think about what the sale would look like. The story that the man told illuminated my colleague's point perfectly, that we pay attention to some things and consider it important because our life story has taught us this is what is important to pay attention to. It might be because of our schooling. It might be because of our family thought that this was important. Basically, it will be whatever has potential to have impact on us. which is the reason why we can all be at the same staff meeting with one another, and walking out, you're thinking, well, that was a total waste of my time, and your coworker turns to you and says, that was a fantastic meeting. How do we make such a call? We decide based on whether our agenda item got addressed favorably and resolved. So the children's Easter balloon drop gets figured out, and your DRE is thrilled. The pastor says, we'll have to put off the conversation about the Triduum program till Friday's huddle, and we go off beating our head against the wall. So intense conversations, we tend to only share our conclusions. So we tend to only speak at the top rungs of the ladder, and we go back and forth about what those conclusions are. And then when we are not persuaded, we tend to share more of our conclusions. We tend to advocate even harder and let more reasons as to why we're right, but then it only compels the other person to give even more reasons as to why they are right, when really the most persuasive thing that we could do here would be to climb down the rungs of the ladder, to find out what is the data that we have different access to? Why are we deciding that this is important? What assumptions and biases do we have? Why or is it that we're seeing things differently and coming to different conclusions? Now, how do we drill down the rungs of the ladder or step down these rungs of the ladder? We can do that by asking those questions that we talked about earlier. Why does this other person see things differently? Why does this matter to him? What led him to hold this conclusion? What's the intent behind the decision that he's made? Why does this line of action really seem to make sense? And rather than share our reasons, what can be far more effective is to spend time finding out and discovering what it is that he considers to be really important on this ladder. Because the position that he holds is going to be grounded in his interests. It's not going to be grounded in your interests. And so for him to change his mind, he's going to need to know the ways that the alternative solutions that you're proposing also address those interests rather than just the interests that you hold. Roger Fisher, who is one of the founders of the Harvard Negotiation Project, noted that when negotiating agreements, agreements rarely will last unless both of the parties in the agreement feel like their interests were met by the agreement. So fortunately, in the church world, in many cases, this is not a real difficult thing to do. We do have lots of shared interests. Even if we don't read the information in the exact same way or arrive at the same conclusions about what should be done, we do have many common hopes. You know, we both want the Triduum to be beautiful. Neither one of us wants to irritate the choir. We both want the program to arrive from the printer no later than Wednesday of Holy Week. Neither of us wants to have music that makes a group in the parish feel ostracized. The best option for moving forward is going to be the one that will meet as many of both of our interests as possible. And so if you are able to convey that you are as committed to making sure that the other person's interests are met, not necessarily the position, but as much of their interest can be met as you are committed to making sure that your own interests are met, you'll be off to a really persuasive start in the conversation. And if you can demonstrate that you're open to changing your own mind, given that your core concerns are addressed, you'll be modeling that kind of behavior that you're asking the other person to engage in. And you can exercise leadership in these situations even if you are not the one who is in charge. So even if it's not immediately reciprocated, model the style of communication that you want them to use when they in turn are speaking with you. So let's take this and go, if we take this back to our scenario, what might this look like? So now when I go into this meeting again, I'm saying, Father Greg, got your phone call, wanted to check in and talk about your idea to change a few songs in the Triduum program. Father Greg speaks. Yes, I've noticed there's not even one song with Spanish in it. We've named that as a pastoral priority this year. When we met in January, we said we want to make sure that that our music is bilingual, making sure that the Latino community here really feels included. Good point. I wish I'd thought about that earlier. So here's my dilemma. I've been practicing songs at the choir since Advent, and it'd be really hard for me to teach them something new during Triduum. The printer is breathing down my throat about the program being in, and I'm thinking there's going to be additional cost for a rush printing job if we don't get the program into them by this afternoon. So can you help me think through the best way to make sure that the Spanish-speaking community is included liturgically, and we can keep the choir sane, and we can deal with the finances as they're written in the budget? Because it sounds like those are really the interests that we're trying to strive for. Now, in having this conversation, we have not figured out anything yet. But now Father Greg is in the problem with me and thinking alongside me about the options that will work, rather than thinking that our interests are pit against one another and that it's a you versus me situation. So let me sum up a little bit about what I've been saying in the 3 points that I've tried to get across in how we get into a conversation. That when getting into a conversation that you find really challenging, the first thing is make sure that you sidestep the triangle, that you speak directly with the person who's involved, that you're frustrated with or that angry with, rather than share that information with everybody else in the office first, but that we have the courage to have direct conversation. Second, that before we go into the conversation, we set manageable goals for ourselves. That we don't go in thinking, I'm going to be able to persuade the other person to see things my way and change his mind about this. But that we go in saying, hey, I'm going to learn something here that I do not know, that I can speak my own piece, and that we can problem solve with one another. And those are achievable, and that's something that is within my control, even if changing the mind of the other person is not. And then finally, as soon as we get in, we can work to step down the ladder. That instead of starting with our conclusions, we can begin by asking questions that get at what's underneath, what's the data that they have that I may or may not have. How are they interpreting this? Why is this really important to them? Oftentimes people ask the question, well, what do you do if you forget all the right words? Like, what are the right words for getting into these conversations? And I think it's not really a question of right words whatsoever. One of my favorite quotes comes from the founder of the Madonna House community, Catherine de Hoek Doherty. And she says, you know, what you say or what you do matters, but not too much. Who you are in these conversations, who you are matters tremendously. And sometimes people will think, if I just get these magic words, everything will work out perfectly. It's not a question of having magic words. It's a question of having what you could say a magic attitude, which is an attitude of curiosity, an attitude of openness. That comes across no matter what words that you have. That comes across in your tone. That comes across in your nonverbals. And even if you find, hey, the person says, I can't believe you said that, you can say, I actually did not mean to say that. That did not get across what I intended. Can I try to say it again? But having that attitude of curiosity will go a tremendous, tremendous distance. I think for myself, I began this webinar by talking about when I was a kid and what I thought working for the church would be like. And I thought that by committing my life to this mission, I would get to live happily ever after. But the longer that I've spent reading the Gospels, I come to discover Jesus never actually said that those who followed him would live happily ever after. Instead, what he said is that they would have life in abundance. And that is quite a different thing. Jesus himself, on the night before he died, in the Gospel of John, it speaks about that dinner that he had, that he called together his friends, people who had been with him for a while, who had hung with him through thick and through thin in the adventures that they had had in roaming through the lands of Galilee and down into Jerusalem. And in that final conversation that he has with his friends before he dies that night, and John, it's like he's saying, this is what I most want you to remember before I depart. And that night he gives to his disciples the parable of the true vine, that he describes his relationship with his disciples as like he is the vine and they are the branches. That is how close, that is the life of communion that he wants them to enjoy. And repeatedly in that parable, he uses one verb over and over and over again of what he wants them to be able to do in the times ahead, difficult though those times are going to be, that he wants them to be able to remain. And I think within our communities, when we practice ourselves and when we offer people within our communities the vision and the capacity and the skills that are needed for doing conflict well, what we're really offering is a pathway for them to be able to remain. And remaining in community during that time, being able to live communion even in the midst of our diversity, what we're really offering people there is not a promise of life happily ever after, but a way of living that abundant life that Jesus does promise that we can have, that we can share, even in the midst of really bustling and boisterous communities. So let me end there, because I would be very curious to know what your questions are about what I've said and what we're talking about, maybe some questions how this applies in the scenario that you're really working with within your own parish community.
Great. Thanks, Ann. Let me open it up to questions. If anyone wants to jump in, we have a couple of people who've jumped in with some questions already and offered in actually some scenarios. I'm guessing what we're probably going to have here. Show my screen. I'm guessing what we're probably going to have here are some specific examples of what's going on in their lives right now. I hope that's okay, and hopefully this isn't turned into like a counseling session necessarily, but I've already gotten a couple of specific stories, and I think that's good. I think the way that you frame the webinar and focusing on a specific scenario helps kind of bring out some of the things we can do. So we're going to start with Paula. Paula talks about a situation in which I'll just read what she says. My question is how would you apply this in a situation where you are clearly the one in charge and responsible for making decisions, say dealing with maintenance or other support staff, for example?
Yeah. So definitely what I am not saying is that you need to give up your authority. Your voice matters a whole lot in the conversation. The question would be and you can make decisions in one of two ways. You can just make the decision and say, hey, that's the way it's going to be. If you actually want a team to begin to pull in the same direction, however, it behooves us as administrators or as leaders to find out what the other side of the story is. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to change your mind, but it will never harm you to find out when I'm asking you to do this. Let's say just with a maintenance person, I've asked you to do this, and this really needs to be done. To find out, it sounds like there's some resistance on your side. Could you talk to me a little bit about what's the impact of what I'm asking of you? Like what I'm asking from where you sit, is there data that I do not have? Is there information that I should know? Because it sounds like this for me may be a simple decision, but for you, there's a bigger struggle with it, and I want to understand why this is a struggle for you. I want to understand why you look at it differently. Because it might be that once I have more data, I might actually change my mind, or I might look at this in a different way, or we might be able to come up with an option that interest and your interest, and then both of us can be pulling in the same direction rather than this being something that I'm trying to enforce over you. So I would still say the same points hold. I still want to make sure that in the conversation my voice gets out there. I still want to make sure that I have asked the questions to find out why they look at this differently. And then I can still ask them, hey, can we problem solve around this together?
Thank you. I have a couple more coming in. I'm just curious, Anne, before I get some of these situations that people are offering, are there any practical kind of reflection practices you might offer to some people? Let's say if you're really angry about something, would you suggest journaling, or is it something that people should be doing, a certain kind of prayer to practice in order to get ready for that conversation? Because it's a hard thing, right? Conflict is difficult. So how do we get ready for that and prepare ourselves for it?
Oh, that's a great question. So sometimes situations just emerge in our office and we don't have any choice about when we're going to have the conversation, right? So, and I know that that's the case. But if we do have a choice about when to have a difficult conversation, oftentimes I would say wait until, if you don't have any questions in your mind whatsoever, it is not the right time to have the conversation. So don't go into the conversation until you find yourself in what I'm going to call a stance of curiosity. So if you just are going into the conversation in order to give them a piece of your mind, but you are not at all yet curious about what theirs is or why they see this differently or what data they might have that you don't have, I would say hold until you have at least one question in your mind. In the book, in chapter 2, there's kind of a chart in there that are some good questions to run through before ever getting into a conversation. And if it's a serious conversation I'm going to have, like one of real impact, I oftentimes will spend some time writing out in advance, this is my version of the story. And then I'll spend some time saying, what do I think the other person's version of the story is? Because oftentimes we find out we do have in our own imagination what we think is going on in their head, and we're getting quite angry about what we think is going on in their head. But if we actually ask the other person, just like in the scenario I gave, if I actually ask the pastor, why are you doing this? The pastor's not going to say, I'm doing this because I've lost my mind. I'm doing this because I don't make any sense whatsoever. I'm doing this just to grate on my liturgy director's nerves. The pastor has another story in his mind. And oftentimes when I try to write out what I think is their version of the story, I'll discover, oh, I don't really know that. Oh, I don't really know that. And then I find out what questions I should go into the conversation asking. Some people say, well, should I just wait until, like, I don't want to bring any feelings into the conversation. And I would actually say feelings are just a piece of being human. You are going to have feelings, and it's okay to have feelings in the conversation, and it's okay for the other person to have feelings in the conversation. But you do probably want to wait until you're able to name your feelings rather than only then shout your feelings. That if you can get to the point where it's fine to bring up, I'm really angry, or I'm really frustrated, or it was a shocker to me to find out that you wanted to make changes in the program now. That's totally fine, but to at least have the feelings not, like you're in a space where you know, I'm not going to yell, I'm not going to scream, I'm not going to slam a door, I'm not going to punch a desk. So both to prepare a little bit in terms of feeling and both prepare a little bit in terms of thinking about what questions you want to ask.
Thanks, Anne. Trying to keep up with some really great questions in here. Dennis is asking about, he says the example you gave is kind of a one-on-one situation. Well, how would you do this in groups? How would you, manage conflict or address conflict in groups?
You'd like to move to the advanced level immediately. I think all of the same principles and practices do apply, but it is really challenging. There's a skill set that's needed for group facilitation. One of, I think, the greatest challenges that many of us face within parish staff situations is when we are both trying to facilitate a conversation and we actually are a party of the conflict at the exact same time. Like, we do have really strong agenda, a real strong position on this issue, that it means a lot to us in our life as being impacted by it. And I think one of the challenges with groups is it's difficult to both facilitate and be a member of the conversation at the exact same time. So in groups, sometimes I would just say, with skill, you can do both, but it's tough. If it's a really hard conversation that your group is having, sometimes it can be helpful to bring in an outside person to facilitate the conversation and to make sure that we can hold ourselves to these practices. Somebody who doesn't have a pot in the fire, somebody who's not committed to a particular outcome, but can just help to create a safe space for a group to have a conversation. I do think, having said that, that there are ways in which groups can really study and practice these skills with one another. And one of the things that I'm most excited about with the book is that we're going to have a free downloadable study guide to go along that I'm hoping parish staffs and religious communities and small congregations could talk with each other about how they want to talk about, how they want to have difficult conversations with each other when they do emerge, how they want to be part of polarizing conversations. And if a group has done its own kind of internal work in that regard, and if it has come up with a covenant for itself about how they want to talk about things that cause them tension, that then it's easier to hold each other accountable when those situations arise. So I'm hoping that that kind of advanced conversation will help groups to be able to practice this as a whole rather than just two-on-two or one-on-one.
Great. And we're getting such great positive comments from people participating in this webinar. Clearly there's some conflict in parishes. Who knew?
No, it's shocking.
Shocker. There was a great question here from Julie, which I think really has to deal with your other book, Redeeming Administration. She says, how do you address a coworker's burnout? Has no more energy or suggestions in trying new things. How would you address that situation?
So difficult conversations don't always mean like you're angry with the other person. If a conversation's difficult, it just can be anything that you have a hard time bringing up. And it sounds, Julie, like one of the things that's really hard for you is like it's hard for you to even know, how do I have this conversation with the other person? I think some of the same principles that we talked with, a way of getting into it can be, I'll just make up the name of the person. Let's just pretend the name of the person is Julie. Julie, one of the things I've been observing lately in our working with each other is that it almost seems to me, at least my way of reading the situation, is that you seem pretty burnt out with the job. I don't know if that's true or not. This is what I'm observing, is that you seem pretty tired, and sometimes when I try to bring up new ideas, it sounds like, I don't know, a frequent response I get is, oh, we've done that before, or I don't have the energy for that, I don't have enough time to do that. I wanted to touch base with you to see, am I reading that scenario correctly? Because I have care about you, and I'm concerned about you, and I just want to let you know what it is that I'm observing, because if there's a way I could help, I would really be interested in helping. I also maybe bring this up because in working in partnership with each other, the way that the burnout's actually affecting me too, or whatever's going on with you is actually impacting me too. It's hard for me to bring up new ideas because I feel like they're going to get shot down. And while I don't want to say, you have to do this, or you have to do things the way I want them done, I just want to let you know that I want to problem solve with you around, could we shift the dynamic of our relationship a little bit so that the ministry can still really continue to thrive. So what I would do is I want to make sure in that conversation that I both offer compassionate concern and find out what the other person's thinking. Am I actually reading it correctly? But then also, if it's impacting me, I want to be able to share a space around, this is how I'm reading it, this is how it's impacting me, this is how I'm feeling about it, this is the way that my job is being influenced by the situation, and can we problem solve? So again, I always am thinking their story, my story, how can we work on this together?
Thanks, Ann. Again, we've got lots of more questions and we got lots of time, so I'm just going to try to read some. We have very long questions and I think situations, so I'm going to try to summarize a couple of them. We've one that I think is essentially dealing with leadership. I guess it could be a pastor in this situation, but maybe it doesn't have to be necessarily, but in which the pastor maybe isn't aware of or of the conflict that's occurring. Maybe it's somebody on staff who's causing some conflict, and they aren't being an active member of negotiating that conflict. What would you do in that situation when you're not the person that's in charge? There's clearly a conflict arising with a particular person or persons, and you don't know how to, since you're not in charge, fix the situation. What would you say? Do you go to the pastor? Do you try to deal with it yourself, or what would you do?
Great question. So I would say the preferable line, and the just sidestep the triangle, as much as possible, if you can talk to the other person yourself, that is, I would say, it's the first act of Christian charity. Is it easy to talk to the other person directly? Absolutely not. Is it an awkward conversation? Totally. And it is what we're challenged to do by our tradition, to have direct conversations. So even when you're talking to the other person that's, let's just say, exhibiting behavior that you would consider problematic from where you sit, again, it's not necessarily that you have the power to make them change or to do something different, but it still can be worthwhile bringing up what it is that they're doing that's really challenging to you, and just sharing, I don't know what your intent is in what you just did, but I just want to let you know the impact on me. And I want to just ask, what was the intent? So those are still powerful conversations to have. If it's regularly impacting, you can definitely go to and you can let the person know, we can resolve this between the two of us. If we're not able to resolve it between the two of us, I think we're going to need to talk with the pastor about it, and bring somebody else in on this conversation. If I'm the pastor in that scenario, if somebody comes to me reporting on a coworker, I'm totally happy to coach them how to have that conversation. Or if they're feeling too nervous or scared about it, I can say, well, we can all have the conversation together, but I'm not going to confront another person on your behalf, at least not without, I need you to do your own confrontation. I need the other person to speak what it is that's in their heart. And I will be able to speak my own perspective, but I'm not going to get triangulated into the middle of the conversation. So when we can bring the pastor in and say, hey, pastor, I'm really having this situation. I really need you to be part of the conversation, and both of us will show up. But I don't ask the pastor to have my confrontation for me. And that would be what I'm saying around try to sidestep the triangle as much as possible. I don't know if I answered your question there, because I'm not sure I have a good read on the full situation.
Yeah, they asked to be somewhat aware of the other
Discreet.
people in the webinar. So yeah, exactly. So
Sure, totally.
trying to be, and it's actually, there's
Yeah.
multiple questions that are very of a similar, or scenarios that are very similar strains. So it's not just one parish, I don't think.
Yeah.
We we have somebody's clarifying question here about the triangulation,
Yeah.
asking, would you say that gossip is a type of triangulation, or is that something different? Are those two terms synonymous, and what are the distinguishing characteristics?
Oh, that's a good question. Gossip oftentimes is a form of triangulation, especially if the purpose of the gossip is to try to influence other people to get on our side, or to take a stance within a situation. So not all gossip is triangulation. I'm trying to think in my mind, is all triangulation a form of gossip? I don't think that's true either. I know for myself, I think for many of us, we're sharing information, we share our perspective on things because we really would like to avoid having a direct conversation that we know could be awkward, that we're not going to know what we want to say, that our words are going to fail us. And it's just easier to blow off steam with our friends than it is to talk with the person who we're angry with. One of the best phrases that one of my colleagues at the school where I teach at gave to me, he said, he was from the South, and he just had a great way with words. He said, Ann, you want your anger to be like a coursing river and not a finely diffused mist. Because oftentimes for myself, once I talk to other people about what I'm mad about, I blow off all my steam, and then I'm not angry anymore, and then I never end up actually having the conversation with the person that I'm frustrated with until they do the next thing. And they never actually find out that I was ever angry with them. Maybe they catch it through my nonverbals, or terse it as an email or something, but they don't find out. And because of that, even though I don't hold on to the anger with them, it doesn't help our relationship to improve. It doesn't actually lead us to deeper experience of communion and diversity. I don't actually learn anything from the other person. So the challenge there, what I'm really saying with the triangulation is, if you can manage to have these conversations directly, it has the potential to really build community versus the blowing off of steam by telling everybody else, the gossiping piece. It may dissipate our anger and enable us to go on, but it doesn't actually build community deeper.
Thanks, Ann. As I'm reading through some of these other ones that are coming in, I wonder, you shared 3 of 12, I guess, would be of the habits, or any other habits you want to throw out that maybe would be valid here with some of the scenarios that people are throwing at you?
Sure. So I talk about in the early part of the book about sidestepping the triangle and how to prepare for a difficult conversation, making sure I'm in a curious stance before I ever go in, and what reasonable aims are for a conversation. But then we end up talking about, once the conversation starts, how do you disentangle intent from impact? So oftentimes what I think that if I had a really good intent going into the conversation, if I have a really good intent in what I've done, that the other person should understand that I had a good intention, even if the impact on them wasn't great. On the flip side, when I've been hurt by something, when the impact of another's actions on me has not been good, I will tend to think that their intent was also bad. I'll think bad things about them, that they were malicious and why they did that. So I have some stuff in there around how do we disentangle intent from impact and clarify that it's possible I could have really good intent and have a bad impact. And it's also possible another person could have really good intent and it could have a bad impact on me. And both of those could be true at the same time. I have a chapter in there about wrestling with feeling and how to handle the feeling dimension, the emotional dimension of these conversations, because it's a very, if there were no feelings involved, it wouldn't be a difficult conversation. We have some stuff in there around speaking across the power differential, about how do I speak up when maybe it's really hard for me to find my voice and I'm really nervous.
A lot of questions about that, so yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, and also if I am the person in power, how do I ask the kind of questions that will elicit what other people are thinking inside their brain but they're too nervous to bring up. And then there's some stuff in there about forgiveness and about how do I say I'm sorry, and how do I let go and move on. And then also around negotiation, how do we try to work on creating options that are a win-win for both of us, where both of us will leave the conversation feeling as much as possible that both of our interests have been met.
Thank you. And I can tell why so many parishes and dioceses are bringing you out, because you have such a wealth of information, and I don't know if I've ever seen so many long comments and questions and pleas for help from participants in a webinar. So thank you so much for sharing your short time today. If they want to find out more about you, about your books, about your the speaking that you do, the coaching that you do, where can they go, or what can they do?
Great. Yeah. So I have a website, anngarrido.com. I also do have a author Facebook page that you're welcome to contact me through there too. And my hope is that in the book itself and the facilitated guide for working through it, that we will find that we have a lot of wisdom within our own communities around this, and that we can help coach each other and bring out the best with each other in these conversations, and that hopefully the book will help facilitate wider conversations within parish communities, so that we can rely on the wisdom and harvest the tremendous experience that's within our own communities.
And the book is Redeeming Conflict, and you mentioned also there's 2 supplemental downloadable resources that are free. They'll be available on Ave Maria Press's website tomorrow. So when we send an email out with the link to the recording of this webinar, we'll also include a link to those resources as well. So the book is already very practical, as I said before the webinar started, Ann. She's got a great, very practical book, but these extra resources really help facilitate the process by which you can go through the book, whether you're a pastor for that resource or going through the process in a small group. Really, I think get access to the wealth of information that you provided. So
Thanks, Jared.
This,
And I would say sorry, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
For myself, one of my deepest concerns for this coming year is that we're entering into a very polarizing electoral
Absolutely.
season. And I have a deep concern about how we will be able to be in communion in the diversity that we have amongst us. And the quality of conversation that we have among Christians is part of the way that we witness to the world. So I'm hoping that in some way, shape, or form, maybe parishes will find it useful to have even conversations beyond their staff about how are we going to be in conversation with each other, even when we don't agree.
I totally agree. It's such an important time for this book to come out, but not even with the election, just with the church in general, and how many people are in conflict in the wider church, whether based on their opinions. What a great conflict, as we say in the description of the book, can be a blessing here, and I think you've given us a great tool to make that happen. So, as always, if you want to access this book, the code for getting 20% off Redeeming Conflict is the word webinar with the numbers 308. That's for today's webinar. You'll get 20% off. We'll send this out again tomorrow to everyone who's participating, and also in case you missed it and you're watching the recording. That promo code will expire next Tuesday, so make sure you use that today or this week before next Tuesday. Once again, I want to thank our partners in the webinar series, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. As I said before, the webinar is being recorded. It will be distributed in our various social media accounts, but it'll also be available on our website, avemariapress.com/webinar-videos. There you'll find a library of all of our webinars dating back for 5 or 6 years now, including Ann's webinar on redeeming and administration from just a couple of years back. We want to invite you to the next webinar in the series. It will be next Tuesday. The webinar is titled Families of Mercy, 10 Practical Ways to Get Families Excited During the Year of Mercy. Michelle Fenley and Emily Jaminet will talk about ways in which we can get in touch with a devotion to divine mercy, but also the works of mercy, and especially how we can get our parishioners excited about the year of mercy, especially as we get close and on the end of Lent, and also continue on through the summer with this important Jubilee year. So join us again next Tuesday at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, March 15th for the next webinar. And once again, I just want to say thanks so much for being here. You get a wonderful presentation. We have so many great people saying thank you, terrific, excellent. Thank you so much. So really appreciate you giving us a little time here on your busy schedule.
Thanks, Jared. And thanks to everybody for coming.
All right. God bless everybody. Have a great week.
God bless.